to introduce our speaker and to share some of the exciting details about the Soar Into STEM program. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Jessica Watson, Wade Pope, Director of Programs. Jessica?
So thank you, Brett. I'm so thrilled to be launching this innovative program, which allows young women and students of color to explore careers in aviation. We're so happy that you're here with us tonight. Students, I wanted to tell you a little bit more about what's in store for you. I'm sure you're wondering. So you'll be meeting right here in this hangar for 4 Saturdays in April, and you'll hear amazing speakers such as pilots, aerospace engineers, coders, map makers, and even the airport director here at Spirit of St. Louis Airport. We have a very talented core of mentors who will be working closely with you to answer questions as you do scavenger hunts, design model airplanes, use a flight simulator, and get to use your very own set of tools on an actual airplane. That one, in fact, and that one is going to be deployed for humanitarian service in Paraguay after our program. So each of you will contribute in a small way to making that happen. Please join me in welcoming Keith O'Brien.
Thank you, Brett, for that introduction. Thank you, Jess, for that introduction. I am the one who's honored to be here tonight, and I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank Meritz and Boeing for your support, and I want to thank the students for coming out tonight and staying out tonight on a school night. It's really special to be here tonight for me. I've been very fortunate in the past several months since this book came out to do a number of events. But tonight is special for a few reasons. The first is, I know that the mission of Wings of Hope is to enrich lives and improve the world through aviation. And I'm here to tell you, as someone who spent 2.5 years researching how aviation can impact people, that it absolutely can change lives and absolutely can change the world. It did for these women here. And number two, each of these women you're going to meet tonight, 85 years ago, argued again and again for young girls to be exposed to science, to engineering, to aeronautics, to physics. And so, as we speak about them here tonight, know that these women would approve of what is happening here and would really be inspired by you, the students. And then the third thing is this, St. Louis, of course, is synonymous with aviation, right? Now, of course, I noticed it as soon as I flew in today and drove out here. You're passing roads named Lindbergh. And for most people, St. Louis is synonymous with a couple of those male aviator names. Charles Lindbergh, of course, and Jimmy Doolittle, for those of you who are from here. But I'm here to tell you tonight, let's flip that script. And it begins with this photo right here, actually. A photo that's on the cover of this book jacket. I want to share something that I've actually never shared with an audience before. This photo right here was taken in East St. Louis in August 1929. These women were competing at that time in the first ever women's air derby, flying across this country from Santa Monica to Cleveland, and the first women's race in the sky. And they flew into East St. Louis, and they took this picture. It's special to me for a few reasons. Obviously, it's on the book jacket. It was how I found it. I initially found this photo on a postcard. I didn't know where the source of it was. I didn't know, when it was taken or anything. And ultimately did track it down right here in St. Louis, at St. Louis University, in the archives there. And even more special than that, at one of my very first book events last summer, a man came up to me at the end of the event in the signing line, and he said, "I want to share a letter with you that my father wrote to his father in 1929. He had no idea the significance of it. He was just saying, my father, when he was a young man, saw these women land a plane. And I said, well, where was your father? And he said, oh, he was in St. Louis. And I started reading the letter, and I realized that his father had seen this. He had seen them land. And he wrote, and I want to share this with you, he said, they all had high-powered ships. And it seemed to me they were taking quite a risk. The first plane came zooming over the field at terrific speed. Right here in St. Louis. So, as we talk tonight, I want you to imagine these women flying right over us on their way to East St. Louis. But I want to be very clear here. This book, of course, is about planes, it's about aviation, and yet it's not. I was drawn to the story that ultimately became Fly Girls because it is the story of an epic quest, populated by characters who were willing to risk everything to do the thing they loved, who had faced adversity after adversity, entrenched discrimination, and the deaths of their friends. And still they would keep flying, still they would keep going, only to triumph in the end, beating the men in one of the most celebrated air races of them all in 1936. That's a story that I would hope anyone would want to tell, and it's certainly one I knew I wanted to tell. And it is just a real honor to share it with you here tonight. So, whenever I'm writing a story, again, whether it's for magazines or National Public Radio or books, I like to think about my stories in terms of scenes, in terms of moments. What are the most important moments? Identify those and then build around them. And so I thought I'd start tonight with you with a moment. I want you to imagine September 1933. The waning days of summer, Labor Day weekend in Chicago. The city at that time had been struggling in the grip of the Great Depression for years. Record unemployment, bread lines down the street. But that weekend, Labor Day weekend in Chicago, 1933, this was going to be different. The city was preparing for a crush of visitors coming in by rail car and automobile. They were coming for an exciting event. They were coming for the air races. Now, we need to forget what we know today about modern air shows. Our polished flying events with the world's best planes. Air racing in the 1920s and 30s, this was a real sport, with winners and losers, jackpots of money for the victors, massive crowds. 500,000 people over the course of a single weekend. At that time in this country, the three most popular sports were baseball, boxing, and air racing, in some order thereof. And so it's one of the most popular sports in America, and it's just definitively, by far, the most dangerous. Inevitably, these pilots flying open cockpit planes at a high rate of speed, low to the ground, would crash. And they would sometimes die right in front of the grandstand. And I want to be very clear here. It wasn't just air racing that was considered dangerous or even dubious at the time. It was flying itself. We always think about flying starting in 1903, right, in Kitty Hawk. But in 1927, when my story begins, there's still a lot of doubt about whether we will ever really fly anywhere. There's real debate happening in this country about will we ever really fly and use this mode of transportation? If we do, will we go by blimps or planes? Nobody knew. And, in my research, I found a series of stories that ran in the Chicago Tribune in the summer of 1927. They were really concerned about what they called wildcat flight schools. A flight school where you could get a pilot's license in just a matter of a few hours. And I want to share one line with you from one of these stories because it's just frankly mind-boggling. I'll read it to you for those of you who can't see it. Officials feel such schools should furnish one or more coffins with each diploma. Okay, so this is 1927. All right, everything's changed, of course. But because I share that with you to say this, because of the danger, perceived danger, because of the risks, because of the crowds of the air races, because of the stakes, because of the money, many men believed that air racing, and indeed flying, was no place for a woman. It's absurd, right? It's sexist, it's obviously demeaning and wrong. But at the time, actual laws on our books forbade women from doing all sorts of things. From driving taxi cabs, from working night shifts. Women were banned from as many as 15 different professions in the late 1920s. And if you were a married woman, in particular, if you were a married teacher, it was even harder for you. If you were a single female teacher in this country in the 1920s, and you had the audacity to decide to get married over the course of that school year, your local superintendent or school board, almost always men, would force you to resign at the end of that year. Because of course, it was believed by these men that a woman couldn't handle the rigors of teaching our children all day, only to go home to raise her own. So women are denied basic rights, access to jobs, things that we would find today to be ridiculous. And they were denied other basic things too. You know, around the time when my story begins, a theater roof collapsed in Washington, D.C., killing a small boy. The boy's mother wished to sue the theater company for negligence, a case she likely would have won. But laws denied her that right. Only a father could collect damages in the wrongful death of a minor child. And this boy's father was already dead, meaning the mother in question had no husband, no child, no recourse. Women hoping to fly planes in the late 1920s faced similar challenges. In the presidential election of 1928, about 90 years ago, there were 29 million women in this country who were eligible to vote. 29 million. Out of that number, 29 million, fewer than a dozen, fewer than 12, had a pilot's license on file at the U.S. Department of Commerce, which was the regulating agency at the time. Fewer than 12. And that really did make the few women who did fly real radicals, real renegades. Labor Day weekend in Chicago in 1933, one of these women was about to do the most radical thing of all. She was going to race the men, whipping her plane around pylons, 50-foot towers placed on the ground in a triangular course. She was 29 years old, this woman, divorced and afraid of nothing. Her plane that day was so fast as to be known to be dangerous. It was called a GB, built in Springfield, Massachusetts, fastest plane of its era, and a plane that had killed many men. But she knew what she was doing. She knew how to fly it. And as she reached the home pylon that Labor Day in Chicago, just at sunset, the crowd knew it too. Coming into that pylon at 220 miles an hour, just 70 feet off the ground. She banked that plane so hard, so perfectly, that it stood up on its wing. Just look at that girl, the announcer said. Those were his words. Just look at that girl. Have you ever seen such a beautiful race? She was trailing the two leaders, but she was vying for third place. She was right there. And then on the 8th turn, at the home pylon, a problem. The right wing of her speedy plane began to disintegrate in mid-flight, buckling under the strain of the speed. This wing, built out of spruce and linen, tore apart and fluttered to the ground like so much confetti. And with the wind now whistling through the holes in her wing, she did exactly as she was supposed to do. She peeled off course, flying away from her competitors and crowd, 40,000 people on the ground. South toward the city of Chicago, out over Glenview Road and Lake Avenue. She was trying to save the people on the ground, and she was struggling to gain altitude to save herself. Everyone now at the airfield in Chicago was watching her little red plane in the sky, knowing one of two things was about to happen. she was going to bail out from a dangerously low altitude, or she was going to crash. Either way, it probably wasn't going to end well. That woman's name was Florence Klingensmith. Many of you probably haven't heard of her. I know I certainly have. You know, when we think about women in aviation in the 1920s and 30s, we tend to think about one or two women. Bessie Coleman, the first African-American female pilot who died in a plane crash in 1926 in Florida, before my story begins. Or, of course, Amelia Earhart, pictured here with Florence at the 1932 air races in Cleveland, right after Florence won the first ever Amelia Earhart trophy for a pylon race of all women. And when we think about Amelia, we tend to think about her flying alone, alone over the ocean, alone into an angry headwind. But at the time that Amelia was flying, other women were flying with her, forming this small but scrappy squad. Each of them was brave. Each of them was bold. Some of them, arguably, were more talented in a cockpit than Amelia. Today, we've forgotten almost everything about them. Their battles and their losses, their friendships and their rivalries, what they fought for, how hard they fought. We've forgotten, too, their seemingly impossible victory over the men. With this book, I hope to change that. Reminding readers of this time and these characters. Women who stood up for themselves and each other again and again. Defiant in the face of rules that were intended to keep them in their place, and confident in the knowledge of who they were. I want to be very clear here. I did not set out to write a comprehensive history of women in aviation in the 1920s and 30s. Sort of textbook history where each woman gets her own chapter. That is not what this book is. If you were going to do that kind of book, you'd need 25 different chapters. My story is really the story of a group of friends who set out to change the world. And I want to introduce you to them briefly now. Ruth Elder was 24 years old in the summer of 1927, already on her second marriage, and living in Lakeland, Florida, where she was answering phones at a dentist's office. It was not the life that Ruth had imagined for herself. So in the summer of 27, she made a bold decision. She knew how to fly a plane, and she decided she wanted to be the first to fly that plane across the ocean. She was inspired, of course, by Lindbergh. Lindbergh flew the ocean in May that year. He blows into Long Island and Roosevelt Field there in the spirit of St. Louis with a plan to fly across the ocean. And, it's important to point out that Lindbergh didn't just make this flight the pioneering spirit of it all. Well, of course, that was part of it. He was doing it for a jackpot of money. $25,000, about $250,000 in today's money, had been put up for the first aviator who could fly nonstop from New York to Paris or Paris to New York. Before Lindbergh leaves in May of 27, many men tried before him and failed in spectacular fashion, crashing on takeoff and planes floated down with too much fuel, dying in burning infernos, disappearing over the ocean, never to be found again. Lindbergh himself nearly crashes on takeoff at Roosevelt Field. His plane nearly doesn't make it off the runway. When it does, he's so low to the ground that the crowd that is gathered at the end of the runway can see his face through the cockpit glass, and they say that he was suddenly aged by worry. He was worried because he was flying straight into a wall of trees, which he narrowly missed, disappeared into the mist, and then wasn't heard from for 33 hours. Of course, I don't think I'm ruining the story to tell you, Lindbergh is going to make it. He will get there. And when he does, he wins that $25,000, he wins the fame, he wins the book deal. He comes back to America where he's given an additional $50,000, about $500,000 in today's money, to fly the Spirit of St. Louis on a goodwill tour across America. 92 cities that summer and fall. And it is in that moment that air fever in this country is born. And it has sort of an accidental side effect, one that at least male aviation officials did not expect. Women now wanted to fly across the ocean, And it's important to note, they were willing to do it for free. Ruth Elder will leave in this plane right here in October 1927. It's 32 feet long, 45 feet across the wings, top speed of 122 miles an hour, no radio. And for this bold flight and this bold plan, Ruth Elder will make headlines around the world.